The first thing anyone noticed about her was how she watched him. In a room thick with smoke and power, where laughter could buy loyalty and silence could cost a life, Isabella Moretti sat at the edge of the DeLuca family table, a porcelain figure in gold silk among men carved from iron. Her attention was not desperate, not girlish, but sharp and unwavering. To them, she was an accessory. To him, she was gravity. The DeLuca empire thrived on control, whispered threats, black suits, and the faint clink of crystal against ambition. Marco DeLuca, 50 and untouchable, rolled from the head of that table like a monarch of smoke and steel. His laughter could fill the room, his silence could freeze it. Naples belonged to him, from the ports to the politics, and yet, behind every meeting, behind every toast, there was always her. She was the calm no one could name, the hush between his commands. Her voice was soft, used rarely, but when she spoke, even the capos listened. Isabella didn't belong in a world of blood oaths and bodyguards. She was born into wealth, not crime, a Moretti heiress whose pearls had never known dirt. Yet here she sat, unflinching, her quiet grace cutting through the cigar smoke like light through fog. The others called her lucky, pitted her behind crystal glasses. But Marco knew better. He once said she studied him, that her silence soothed what the streets had hardened. And perhaps, in another life, that would have been enough. Marco never asked her to attend these gatherings, yet she was always there. At his right hand when business turned bloody. Across the room when his temper flared. She brought him peace in a life that knew none, small gestures no one else noticed. A napkin straightened before he spoke, a touch on his sleeve before he lost control, a single glance that could still his rage better than any gun. He called her his quiet. And she wore the title like a crown. There were moments, fleeting, fragile, when he caught her reflection watching him in the burnished wood of the conference table. Not as a lover watched a man, but as a believer watched something dangerous and divine. She left small traces of herself in his world, a pressed white rose in the pages of his ledger, a note of caution before a deal turned deadly, a soft touch on his hand before the storm. They were tokens no one else saw. But for Marco, they were reminders that there was still something human left in his empire. Before we continue, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing off the laughter that still echoed in her ears like broken glass. Isabella stood in the hallway, hand still clutching the silver lighter she had come to return, now cold and unnecessary. Her throat felt lined with ash, and though she tried to breathe, her lungs refused to expand. The word clung to her skin, Clingy, said by the only man she'd ever trusted with silence. She blinked once, then turned, heels soft against the marble as she walked away from a world she had helped build but no longer recognized. She did not sleep that night, though her bed remained untouched. Instead, she sat by the fire in the drawing room long after the servants had gone, a glass of untouched wine trembling in her hand. She stared at the flames as if they might burn the sound out of her memory. Her reflection shimmered in the dark glass of the French doors, pale and still, a woman suspended in smoke. Dawn bled slowly into the sky, and when the city stirred, Isabella rose and walked back to her chambers as if she were returning from a funeral. Breakfast was served precisely at 9 as always. The long table gleamed, fresh fruit sliced with surgical precision, espresso poured into delicate cups. Marco strolled in late, kissed her temple absently, and slid into the seat beside her without noticing the tension in her frame. "We're meeting the Giordano boys this afternoon. Might get ugly," he said, buttering toast with the ease of a man at war with no one. Isabella said nothing, eyes fixed on the window, hands folded in her lap like folded wings. He didn't notice it at first. Not when she skipped the meeting with the Giordanos. Not when she failed to comment on the new tailor's questionable taste in lapels. But by dinner, something shifted. She wasn't at the table, and no one could recall her speaking all day. "Where's Isabella?" he asked, and the silence that followed was too long. A murmur passed between staff like smoke. "She hasn't spoken since last night." Marco brushed it off with a scoff, that grin he wore like armor. She's upset. Women get like that, he muttered, though he glanced toward the hallway with a flicker of unease. That night, she didn't come to his bed. He waited, shirt half unbuttoned, the fire low, the shadows long. Eventually, he rose and poured himself a drink, telling himself she'd be back by morning. She wasn't. Nor the next. Days folded into one another like origami, sharp-edged, delicate, and unreadable. Isabella moved through the villa like mist, present but impossible to hold. She did not avoid him, nor did she seek him out. Her eyes, once warm and watchful, now passed over him like wine through branches, touching, but never staying. Marco tried to pretend it didn't matter. He held meetings, made deals, ordered wine. But the house felt altered. The music from the old record player felt louder, the halls colder, and the food, no matter how fine, tasted like nothing. On the fourth morning, he found a silver lighter on the floor outside the banquet room. It was his, heavy, engraved with a tiny lion crest. One he had carelessly dropped the night of the toast. He frowned and turned it over in his palm, noticing the small nick along its side. Something inside him stirred, faint, disquieting, but he pushed it down. He knocked on her door that evening, a bottle of wine in one hand, the lighter in his pocket. She opened it after a pause, her figure wrapped in a robe the color of bone, hair pinned up like she hadn't moved all day. "I missed you," he said. She said nothing, just stepped aside and returned to her seat by the window. He set the wine down untouched and sat near her, but the silence between them felt heavier than the years they had known each other. Marco tried jokes, stories, news from the street. He told her about the idiot who tried to shortchange him, how he'd fixed it with a look. Nothing. Not a smile, not a blink. Her gaze remained on the window, on nothing, on everything. The silence was not resistance, it was retreat. The staff adjusted before he did. They lowered their voices around her, stopped asking questions. Meals were delivered quietly. Books left on her chair were moved, then returned, always with the bookmarks advanced by a few pages. She was still living, still present, just unreachable. Weeks passed. Marco began to unravel. His rage came in bursts, slamming his fist into the desk when she passed him without a glance, shouting at Kapos for breathing wrong. One night, he ordered the head chef fired because the risotto was bland. It wasn't. It tasted like every meal he'd had since she went quiet, empty. He asked her once, outright. "Are you punishing me?" he said, leaning against the doorway of her sitting room. "Is that what this is?" She didn't respond. Just turned another page in the book resting on her lap. He wanted to tear it from her hands, shake her, make her speak, but the part of him that loved her wouldn't let him touch her at all. By the second month, he stopped pretending it was just a phase. She didn't come to the Sunday dinners, didn't ask about the numbers, didn't remind him to take his pills or carry his gun. She was a presence that felt like an absence. And the worst part, the part that chilled him, was that she no longer looked hurt. She looked hollow. One night, he returned late from a meeting and found the lights still on in her reading room. She was curled in a chair, one slipper hanging from her foot, her face half lit by the glow of a lamp. A book was open in her lap, but her eyes were unfocused. He stood there for a long time, just watching her, and for the first time, he felt like the intruder. He turned away before she noticed. Or maybe she had noticed and just hadn't cared. Marco asked the housekeeper one morning, quietly, "Has she said anything?" The woman hesitated, then shook her head. "She hums sometimes," she offered. But no words. Not since that night. Marco dismissed her with a wave, but his hands shook after she left. The realization that she was gone, truly gone, but still there under the same roof, was worse than any betrayal. Marco had been shot at, nearly poisoned, betrayed by blood. But nothing had ever made him feel as powerless as her silence. He would have welcomed a scream, a slap, even a knife. Anything to prove she still had fire. Instead, he had only echoes. The broken lighter stayed in his pocket for weeks. He carried it without knowing why, a talisman, a weight. He turned it over in meetings, in the car, on walks through the garden. It smelled faintly of her perfume, the one with hints of jasmine and smoke. The same scent she had worn the night everything had changed. One night, Marco sat alone in his study and pulled the lighter out again. The nick along the side caught the firelight. He stared at it for a long time, then closed his eyes and finally let the memory replay the toast, the laughter, the word. Clingy. He whispered it aloud and felt like the room dropped a few degrees colder. Outside, it began to rain. In her room, Isabella sat by the window, as still as stone. Lightning cracked against the Neapolitan sky, casting long shadows on the marble floor. She didn't flinch. Because what could thunder do that hadn't already been done by a single, careless word? She had loved him without asking, protected him without needing permission, stood behind him even when the world called her a fool. But when he spoke that word, laughing, loud, cruel, she saw the truth. He had never seen her as a partner. Just a soft thing to be tolerated, a luxury, not a person. And so she stayed. But not for him. Not anymore. The chapter closes on her still form seated before the rain-slicked glass, untouched book in her lap. Her expression unreadable. Her silence no longer soft, but sharp. Not a protest, not a punishment. Just survival. Marco DeLuca had fixed empires with less than what he was about to throw at her. Wars between families had ended with fewer phone calls, fewer deals, fewer apologies. But love, or the wounded ghost of it, demanded a different currency, one he didn't understand. So he paid the only way he knew how, extravagance. And in the weeks that followed Isabella's silence, his campaign began. It started with diamonds, 2 carats, teardrop-shaped, nestled in velvet. They arrived on her vanity with a handwritten note, "For your silence, may it never dull your shine." The note wasn't clever, but he thought it might coax a smirk. It didn't. The box remained unopened for 3 days before the maid quietly returned it to the vault. Next came the furs, ivory mink, imported from Zurich, lined with satin and gilt. He remembered her once admiring the exact shade in a boutique window years ago. He had ignored it then. Now he sensed 6. She draped none over her shoulders, never even touched the hangers. By the time the villa came into play, Marco was growing desperate. It sat along the Amalfi Coast, tucked between cliffs and lemon groves, a private slice of paradise he had planned to give her someday. Someday became now. The keys were sent in a mahogany box with a card that read simply, "Yours. Always." She never acknowledged it. The staff whispered, now soft, unsure things like, "Is she grieving? And maybe she's sick?" They no longer made eye contact with him when he entered a room. His presence, once absolute, now trembled at the edges. The woman who had once given him stillness had taken hers with her, and the absence stung more than he wanted to admit. He began sleeping in his office again. The house changed with her silence. Music disappeared. The piano gathered dust. Even the wine tasted different, too sweet, too sharp, too old. Marco barked at the sommelier to fix the cellar, though the bottles were fine. Nothing was wrong, and yet everything was off. In public, Marco smiled wider than usual. He told jokes louder. He ordered more expensive champagne and tipped in thousands. At dinners with other dons, he made sure to toast to Isabella, even if she was not at his side. "She's just resting, you know how women get," he joked once, and the laughter that followed from the men felt colder than the marble beneath his shoes. The capos started to notice. They always did. Men who dealt in blood and loyalty could sense rot long before it spread. "You look tired, boss," Enzo offered, voice mild, eyes too sharp. "She's not leaving, is she?" Marco didn't answer him, not directly. He just lit a cigar and stared out the window of the club's private lounge, watching the rain stitch patterns into the dark streets. She hadn't left, no. She hadn't needed to. He was the one who felt exiled in his own home. The gifts continued because he didn't know what else to offer. Perfumes from Paris, hand-bound books from Florence, a watch engraved with the date they first met, each one a stone in the growing monument of his failure. They sat untouched. Not returned, not destroyed. Just ignored. And that indifference unmoored him more than rage ever could. Isabella, for her part, walked the gardens each morning like a ghost revisiting her old life. The same path, the same pace. She wore no jewelry, no expression. Her silence had shape now, not passive, not cruel. It was simply the space she had carved between them, and he could not cross it. He watched her once from the library window, thinking about how easily she used to fit beneath his arm. Her head had once leaned into his chest like it belonged there. Now she didn't even glance at the house. She only looked forward, as if something ahead was calling her, and he was a shadow behind her she had chosen not to turn toward again. He tried sitting beside her in the garden one morning. No staff, no noise, just the rustle of olive branches overhead. She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't flee. But she didn't look at him either. And somehow, that was worse than her walking away. He returned to the house, cracked a decanter of bourbon that cost more than most cars, and drank until the walls swam. "She wants to punish me," he muttered to no one. "Fine." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. There was no vengeance in her silence. There was only grief. The household began to shift around her. Meals were left at her door and retrieved untouched hours later. Her clothes were laundered, pressed, and returned, but she wore the same few soft garments every day. Even the cat, the stray she used to feed behind the kitchen, no longer waited by the garden door. The house breathed differently now. It inhaled tension and exhaled regret. Marco's temper frayed at the edges. He shouted at a footman for dropping a glass. Fired the florist because a bouquet arrived wilted. Demoted a capo for chewing gum in a meeting. But none of it brought her back. And every door he slammed echoed louder in the hollow space she left behind. He stopped bringing gifts to her room. He started leaving them by her favorite chair instead, the one in the reading room by the window. One day, a small velvet box. Another, a photograph of them taken years ago in Milan, her smile radiant, his rare and unguarded. The photo stayed where he left it, face down. Eventually, even the courtship became a spectacle. The wives of other dons whispered. "He's unraveling," one said. Over a woman. The men were quieter, more dangerous in their silence. Marco's power had once been built on fear. Now it trembled on perception. One afternoon, the staff arranged the newest bouquet in a crystal vase, white lilies, fresh, fragrant, painfully beautiful. Marco took them himself this time. Climbed the stairs in silence, bouquet in hand, cufflinks glinting like armor he no longer earned. He knocked once, then again. No answer. He stood there longer than he meant to. Hand still raised, flowers trembling slightly in his grip. The hallway was silent, no footsteps, no voices, just the distant hum of a house that no longer remembered its own heartbeat. Finally, he turned the knob. Found the door locked. A new thing. She had never locked him out before. He stood there for a full minute. Then he lowered the flowers, laid them gently on the floor like an offering to something holy, and walked away. No curses. No rage. Just shame. Have you ever tried to make something right, only to realize you didn't understand what broke it in the first place? Tell us in the comments, what do you think Marco should have done instead? And subscribe to follow the story in this slow-burning, heart-wrenching story. The cigars burned low, the brandy sat warm in wide glasses, and the cards fanned out across the velvet like a trap. It was late, the kind of late that only men like Marco DeLuca survived, stitched together by adrenaline and secrets. Around the table sat men who once killed for him, now relaxed in their shirt sleeves and loosened ties. Laughter came easy when power filled your lungs like smoke. And for a moment, Marco let himself pretend he wasn't unraveling. "You know what I can't stand," said Antonio, his consigliera, flicking ash into a crystal tray. "Those women who hover like ghosts. Like they're waiting to be relevant." A few chuckles rose, the kind bred not from agreement, but habit. Then Antonio added, "Remember that line you dropped years ago? About clingy women?" He grinned. "Man, you said it so smooth, she's a little clingy, but she means well." Classic. The table laughed again, deep, rough sounds of remembered bravado. Marco didn't laugh. He didn't move. The moment hit him like a fist between the ribs, not loud but precise. The glass in his hand didn't tremble, but something beneath his skin cracked open. The noise around him dulled, like he was underwater. His ears roared with the silence. He suddenly recognized her silence. He saw it all, not as fragments anymore, but as one horrible thread pulled tight. The night of the port celebration. The lighter she brought to return. The exact words. She was standing right there. He leaned back slowly, blood draining from his face so subtly no one noticed. But inside, something had shifted, tectonic and final. The laughter faded behind him like a door closing. Antonio kept talking, oblivious, but Marco no longer heard him. He was staring into a past that had finally turned around and looked him in the eye. The next morning, he walked the halls like a man moving through wreckage. Each step echoed too loudly, every shadow stretched too far. He saw the spaces she used to fill, the spot at the end of the table, the bench in the garden, the windowsill where she liked to press her fingers to the glass. The house hadn't changed, but it no longer belonged to him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver lighter, the one she had returned. The one he'd carried like a talisman without understanding its weight. He turned it in his palm, thumb tracing the nick along the edge. She had heard him. That moment, that stupid joke, had shattered something sacred, and she had heard every word. He closed his hand around the lighter and stood outside her door. He didn't knock. Not this time. He knew she wouldn't answer. Instead, he leaned his forehead against the cool wood and whispered, "It was me." He returned to the library and sat in the chair she used to favor. He didn't pour a drink. He didn't light a cigar. He sat in the silence he had earned, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like penance. He remembered the way she had looked at him the morning after that night, not angry, not even wounded, just absent. He had seen it then and brushed it off. He had told himself she was tired, that women were emotional, that she'd bounce back. All the lies he wrapped around his ego to protect it from what he'd done. He had watched her disappear and blamed her. He had thrown money at the wound and called it generosity. He had misunderstood grief as stubbornness. But now the veil was gone. And he saw it, clear as blood on marble. He had broken her. There was no fixing this. No necklace, no villa, no bouquet grand enough to rewind what he'd made her feel. He had taken something whole and pure and cracked it for sport. Not out of malice, worse, out of casualness. That word, thrown like dice across a card table, had rewritten the script of their lives. He rose slowly and went to her room. The hallway was quiet, the air tight as glass. He didn't bring anything this time, no gifts, no flowers, no apology wrapped in luxury. Just the lighter in his palm. A weight, not an offering. He knocked once, and when there was no answer, as expected, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. She was there, curled in the chair by the window, her body still as snow. Her eyes flicked toward him once, then back to the sky. That was more than he deserved. He walked slowly, not toward her, but to the floor beneath her window. He didn't speak at first. Just sat, not in a chair, not like a man in command, but on the cold marble, legs folded, head lowered. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was charged. He opened his hand and placed the lighter gently on the floor between them. "You brought it back that night," he said, voice hoarse. "You heard me." She didn't move. But he wasn't looking for movement anymore. He was giving her what should have come long ago, acknowledgement. "I didn't mean it," he continued. "But that doesn't matter. I said it." He paused, breath shallow. "You came to bring me something, and I gave you a joke. A cheap, careless joke to make men laugh, men who don't even matter." Her eyes didn't leave the window, but her shoulders had shifted, the subtlest tension in her posture. He noticed. It broke him a little more. He pressed his palms against the stone, grounding himself as if gravity alone could hold him together. "I don't know how to make this right," he said. "Maybe I can't. Maybe that one word took more from you than I have time left to give back." He looked up, meeting the side of her face, beautiful and remote as moonlight. "But I'm here." He stayed there for hours, saying nothing else. She didn't speak. She didn't move. But she didn't leave. And that, to Marco, felt like a mercy he hadn't earned. When he finally rose, it wasn't with the sharpness of a man scorned. It was with the slowness of a man who had stopped trying to be forgiven and started learning how to be small. He didn't touch her. Didn't try. He left the room the way he came, quiet, unarmed, humbled. That night, he stood alone in his study, looking at the family portrait on the wall. His hand brushed over her image, frozen in time, a smile soft at the edges, eyes lit with something that used to be trust. He lowered his hand. He had no right to that smile anymore. No more silk dresses she'd never touch, no more polished wood boxes with velvet linings, no more keys to homes she'd never visit. It took him too long to understand, but once the truth settled in, it did not leave. She did not want his money. She did not want his power. She had wanted only to be seen, and now she had vanished in plain sight. He began to change in small, almost invisible ways. He woke earlier, not because of meetings or threats, but to sit in the garden before the noise of the world could reach her. He learned how to walk without the sound of his shoes echoing down the corridor. He stopped speaking to staff as if they were extensions of his will. And slowly, he stopped speaking at all, unless it was to her. He came every day now, a ritual born not from obligation, but from something raw. Sometimes he sat beside her on the bench near the olive trees, saying nothing, just breathing the same air. Sometimes he sat in the reading room while she looked out the window, speaking only to the space between them. It was not about being heard. It was about being present. Being there when he hadn't been before. The first time he brought a book, it was one she used to read aloud on stormy nights, a battered novel of letters between two doomed lovers. He didn't ask if she remembered. He just opened to the beginning and began to read, his voice low, the words trembling against old guilt. She did not turn to him, but she did not leave. Her hands remained still in her lap, but her breath caught once, subtle, but real. He noticed. He read to her again the next day. And the next. Some days it was novels. Some days it was news, old letters, things he wrote himself. Not confessions, not apologies, stories. Threads of a life she had once been the anchor of, now retold with quieter hands. In one reading, he spoke about his brother. The younger one, Tommaso, the one who died in a crossfire when they were boys with too much pride and too few choices. I was 15, he said, staring at the fire, his voice no longer that of the kingpin, but a man hollowed by memory. They said he shouldn't have been there. That it was my fault. I carried him 6 blocks before he bled out in my arms. Isabella didn't flinch. But her hand, resting on the arm of her chair, curled slightly, a small contraction, like her body remembered how to hold grief even when her mouth would not speak it. Marco paused when he saw it. He didn't call it out. He just kept reading. The next day, he told her about his first job, not the official one, but the one that mattered. Delivering a message for Don Silvano, running across rooftops in the rain with blood on his collar and a name in his pocket. I was too young, he said. Too angry. I thought fear was power. He looked at her then, really looked. You were the first person who made me want something quieter. She didn't look back. But he could feel it, the shift, subtle as dawn. The silence was no longer impenetrable. It had texture now. Not a wall, but a room with the door cracked open. He remembered the time she slipped a folded note into his coat pocket before a volatile meeting with the Cesare family. A single sentence, "Do not sit with your back to the window." He hadn't asked why. He just obeyed. An hour later, the window shattered from a sniper's bullet. She had saved his life with silence more times than he could count. Now it was his turn to return the favor. To be her guard against noise, against pressure, against anything that told her she owed him a word. So he waited. Not for a reply, but for permission to stay. Some days he brought her small things. Not gifts. Just moments. A pressed flower from the garden. A photograph from a better year. A scrap of poetry he once mocked but now found himself rereading like scripture. He left them quietly on the table beside her chair, on the windowsill, between the pages of the book he was reading aloud. Sometimes she moved them, sometimes not. He never asked for more. Each object was not a demand, but a vow, I still see you. He watched her learn how to breathe again in his presence. Watched the way her fingers played with the hem of her sleeve when he mentioned Sicily. Watched the way her shoulders tightened when he mentioned his father. The way her gaze softened, just for a breath, when he said her name, not as a plea, but as a remembering. Isabella, he would say at the end of each visit. Just once. A goodbye. A reminder. A prayer. The house adjusted too. Staff who once scurried now moved like shadows. Meals were lighter, simpler. Her space was sacred. Even Enzo, once brash and loud, lowered his voice when speaking near her door. Marco had not ordered this change. It happened because they saw him change. One evening, he returned from a meeting with blood on his sleeve. Not his, but too close. He washed his hands before seeing her, changed his shirt, combed his hair. He didn't want the dirt of that world entering her room. It was the first time he noticed he had begun dividing his life into two, with her and without. That night, he didn't read. He sat quietly, watching her silhouette against the window, silvered by moonlight. After a while, he spoke, barely above a whisper. If I could go back, he paused. I wouldn't just unsay the word. I'd unmake the man who said it. She turned her head slightly. He saw her profile in the glass. For the first time, her expression was not blank, it was distant, yes, but not unreachable. Like a photograph slowly developing, detail by detail. He stayed later than usual that night. Just sitting. Watching the snow gather in the corners of the garden path. And when he finally stood, he didn't expect anything. He had stopped expecting. He had started listening. As he reached the door, she shifted. Barely. But her head tilted, just a little, as if following the sound of his footsteps. He paused. Said nothing, but his heart ached in his chest like something waking from a long sleep. The next day, he brought her a book of poems. She didn't touch it. But that night, when he returned, he found it open to the first page. It stayed open all week. Marco stopped pretending he understood healing. He accepted that grief did not respond to power, nor silence to force. What had once been his empire now narrowed to the square feet of her room, the rhythm of her breath, the minute shifts in her stillness. And in that quiet, he began to become someone else, not the man who broke her, but the one who would stay. Have you ever had to unlearn everything you thought love meant just to understand someone who is hurting? Leave a comment sharing what real presence looks like to you, or subscribe to see what happens when silence begins to shift. 6 winters had come and gone since she last said his name. Naples had not seen snow like this in decades, thick, blinding, muffling the city in white silence. The villa sat blanketed in hush, every column and rooftop glazed with frost, every tree draped in weightless lace. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, as if the world outside had finally mirrored the quiet that had ruled the DeLuca household for years. Marco stood at the tall windows, watching it fall. Inside, the fireplace crackled low in the study, the only sound in a home now shaped by restraint. He had not seen her all morning, but her presence lived in the spaces between things: the folded blanket on the armchair, the faint scent of rosemary and smoke. He knew better than to call for her. The days of summoning were over. He was no longer the kind of man who believed in being answered. He moved through the hall without hurry, a book tucked under his arm, fingers half frozen from standing too long near the drafty windows. The corridors were dim, the sconces flickering with golden light as if even fire had learned to be softer here. Then, just as he turned into the study, he saw her, standing at the far end of the room, her back to him, lighting candles one by one. The glow touched her face gently, outlining the hollow of her cheek, the curve of her jaw. She was barefoot, wrapped in a heavy knit cardigan, hair falling loosely over her shoulder like a shadow undone. He did not speak. The silence between them had long since become a language he was learning to respect. He crossed to the shelf, choosing a photo album not because he meant to, but because it was easier than standing still and trembling. The leather was worn, the corners bent with years. He sat in the chair nearest hers, not too close, not too far, and open to the first page. The photographs were old, some faded, some sharp. Isabella laughing on a beach in Ischia, her hair tangled by the wind. Her hand resting on his shoulder during a New Year's dinner, wine in her eyes. There were pictures from the early years before the silence, before the empire had cost them both more than they knew they were paying. He turned the pages slowly, letting each image speak to the man he used to be. He felt her move. just slightly. The soft shift of fabric, the way a body adjusts in awareness of another. It wasn't much, but after 6 years, it was enough to make his chest tighten. He didn't look up. He didn't want to break the fragile thread of presence she was offering. So he kept flipping. Halfway through the book, he paused. A picture of her sitting on the hood of his car, sun-drenched, mid-laugh, head thrown back, hands bracing her against the curve of metal. He remembered taking that shot himself. Remembered how she'd teased him for the angle. He stared at it for too long, as if he could step through it and drag them both back. She sat down. Not in her usual window chair, but closer on the arm of the adjacent sofa. It was the nearest she'd been to him in years. He didn't dare move. Even his breathing adjusted, shallow and reverent, as if the wrong breath might undo this moment. Page after page turned beneath his fingertips. Christmases, weddings, quiet dinners with too much wine. He paused at a photo of her holding a candle, the light illuminating her face in a way that was almost holy. Her expression had been soft, unguarded. He had no idea who took that one. He was certain now he never deserved it. Then a shift. Not loud, not dramatic, but warm and human and utterly unexpected. Her hand reaching, soft as snowfall. Fingertips brushed the back of his wrist. He froze. The contact was featherlight. She wasn't gripping him, wasn't holding, just touching, as if to confirm he was real, as if to say, "I remember you." The hand that had once touched his face with unthinking tenderness now hovered, tentative and aching, like a bird testing the wind. Marco didn't breathe. The hand stayed. A second. 2. Enough time to register heat. Enough time for every cell in his body to scream, "Don't move. Don't ruin this." His eyes did not leave the photo in front of him, but his focus had narrowed to that one point of contact. It was not forgiveness. He knew that. It was not an ending or a beginning, but it was something. And after 6 years of absence dressed as presence, it felt like being seen again. His throat tightened, not from sadness, from reverence, from the unbearable relief of still being allowed this moment, even if only for a breath. Then she withdrew. Her fingers slipped away gently, the warmth gone in an instant. She stood and walked to the far window, facing the storm outside. Her back was to him again, the way it had been that first night. But something in the air had shifted. He closed the album slowly, rested his palm over its cover like a benediction. There were no words to say, no words he'd earned. But for the first time in years, he felt closer to understanding what presence meant, what quiet grace looked like. She had touched him. She had chosen, of her own volition, to reach across a canyon he built. Not because he asked. Not because he begged. Because she wanted to. He stood a few minutes later, unsure how to leave. Unsure how to walk away from a moment that had cracked open a second chance. He turned toward the door, heart aching with something that resembled hope, not bright, but patient. A slow thaw. Before he left, he looked back once. She was still at the window, hand against the glass, watching the snow fall in thick, lazy spirals. The candles flickered beside her like small sentinels. Her outline glowed faintly, quiet, sacred. Marco did not speak. He bowed his head and left in silence, carrying the warmth of her fingers like fire in his veins. The snow didn't stay long in Naples. It melted by morning, dripping off iron railings and rooftop edges like the end of a long dream. But the change it brought into the DeLuca house did not melt with it. Something had shifted the night Isabella reached for him, not loud, not absolute, but enough. And from that night forward, the way they moved around each other began to change. She started entering his office again. Not often, not announced. But she would slip in like dusk, quiet, unobtrusive, and settle into the chair near the tall windows while he worked at his desk. She never looked at him directly, never spoke, never lingered too long. But she came back. The first time it happened, Marco said nothing. He only nodded once, more to himself than to her, and kept reading over the territory reports from Salerno. But his hands trembled for 10 minutes afterward, the pen nearly slipping from his grip. Her presence was no longer a ghost. It was real, and it made the room feel warm for the first time in years. The staff noticed, of course. They always did. One of the maids passed her in the hall and bowed without speaking, as if Isabella were made of breath and memory. Even Enzo, rough-edged and irreverent, lowered his voice when entering the study. No one had to be told. The entire house had learned a new language, hers. Marco adapted quickly. Not with grand declarations, but with restraint. He didn't ask her to stay. Didn't question her when she left the moment anyone else entered. He accepted the boundaries she never spoke aloud and guarded them more fiercely than he guarded the safe in his cellar. The new ritual grew from small things. A chair shifted closer to the fireplace. A cup of tea left warming beside it. A blanket folded without fanfare. She didn't acknowledge these offerings. But she didn't move them away either. And for Marco, that was answer enough. He began bringing her objects, not gifts, not bribes, just fragments of a shared past. Her mother's old recipe book, tucked between sheets of tissue paper. He'd had one of the maids track it down from the storage in the north wing. It still smelled faintly of oregano and pressed lavender. He left it on the side table by her chair. The next day, the book had been opened to the soup section. Once, he placed a small paper crane on the edge of her desk. It had been folded by a child at a charity event Isabella once organized years before silence made her invisible. She used to keep such trinkets in a box by her bedside, relics of softness. When Marco passed through the study that evening, the crane was gone. He found it the next morning tucked into the corner of her windowsill. He didn't bring diamonds anymore. He brought the ordinary, and somehow it mattered more. A sprig of rosemary from the greenhouse. A stone shaped like a heart from the garden path. A photograph of her with her goddaughter, taken the summer before everything fell apart. Each thing chosen not for value, but for meaning. And though she never spoke, she saw them. She also began to move differently. Where once she drifted like fog, now her steps had more intention. She didn't linger in hallways anymore. She sat. She read. She stayed. It wasn't constant, wasn't dramatic. But it was enough to remind Marco what hope felt like when it was earned, not assumed. She started watching him again. Not always. Not obviously. But sometimes, when he stood by the window on a call, he'd catch the faintest flicker of her gaze sliding toward him before settling back on the page in her lap. He never acknowledged it. Never chased it. He let her look, and he let it be hers. When guests came, she disappeared. Always. The moment someone knocked, or voices rose in the hall, she would close her book, rise, and leave without a sound. Marco never stopped her. He simply adjusted. Meetings became shorter. Conversations more careful. No one was allowed to raise their voice near the West Wing. The capos didn't question it. Not anymore. They had seen the change in their boss, not in weakness, but in reverence. Marco no longer filled rooms with noise. He no longer answered disobedience with shouts. He ruled differently now. Not less fiercely, but more precisely, as if the silence he lived with had taught him to measure every word before it left his mouth. He was no longer the man who demanded presence. He was the man who waited for it. Some evenings, they sat in the study as night crept through the windows. He would light the fire, open a book, and read in low tones. She would sit nearby, eyes lowered, hands curled gently in her lap. Occasionally, he would glance up and find her staring into the flames, her profile cast in gold. He would say her name once before leaving. Nothing more. Isabella. It was a ritual. A tether. Not an expectation. One night, he spoke of regret, not as apology, but as history. I used to think love was about what you could give, he murmured, closing a leather-bound journal on his lap. Power. Safety. Control. But it's not. It's how much you're willing to stay when you're powerless. She didn't respond, but her shoulders shifted. Her fingers flexed slightly. She stayed longer that night. Over time, the staff began to smile again. Quietly, gently. The house no longer held its breath. It moved differently, slower, softer, as if the air itself had turned toward healing. Even the piano, untouched for years, was cleaned and polished, though no one played it. One afternoon, Marco entered the library and found a small glass of white wine waiting on his desk. He hadn't asked for it. He hadn't touched alcohol in weeks. But it sat there, perfectly chilled, beside an open ledger. He looked up. She was seated in the armchair, back straight, eyes on the window. He sat across from her, nodded once, lifted the glass. Drink. She didn't look at him. But she knew. And that was the new shape of their love, not loud, not adorned. But present. Trusted. Quietly sacred. The envelope arrived on cream stationery, embossed with gold, sealed with the DeLuca crest. Her name was written in Marco's handwriting, Isabella Moretti, no titles, no notes, just the invitation. It was Enzo's wedding, the first major DeLuca family gathering since the silence began. Marco left it on her side table without a word, unsure if she'd attend, unsure if he should hope. She picked it up that night and placed it on her dresser, beside a bottle of perfume she hadn't touched in years. The morning of the wedding, Marco stood in the hallway adjusting his cufflinks when he heard the sound of her door opening. He turned, almost afraid to see her, and then forgot how to breathe. She stepped into the light in a black silk gown that clung like water and moved like smoke, her hair swept back, her posture regal. No makeup, no jewelry, and yet she looked untouchable. She did not speak. She simply nodded once, and he offered his arm. The car ride to the cathedral was quiet. Marco didn't try to fill the silence, didn't ask how she felt. He didn't want to disturb whatever balance had made this moment possible. The air between them was charged, not tense, but fragile, like a thread being pulled taut. When she looked out the window, snow falling in soft spirals, he thought she looked more like a queen than she ever had before. The cathedral was full of the usual: velvet pews, too much gold, and men who dealt in blood wearing smiles like masks. Everyone noticed when Isabella walked in. Every head turned. The silence that followed was subtle, but sharp, like knives held behind backs. Marco walked beside her, not in front of her, and that small detail did not go unnoticed. Enzo's bride looked radiant. The ceremony began with the kind of pomp only old money could afford. Marco watched the proceedings only half attentively. His focus kept flicking back to Isabella beside him, her stillness, her silence, her undeniable presence. She had not come for the family. She had not come for him. She had come for herself. During the reception, champagne flowed too freely and music filled the courtyard where heaters glowed like amber beacons. Marco remained near her, a shadow at her side, not because he was guarding her, but because he felt steadier there. She didn't mingle, didn't dance. But she stood beneath the fairy lights like a woman carved from control. She didn't flinch when people whispered. She didn't shrink when they stared. Some dared approach. A few old friends greeted her with cautious smiles. One kissed her cheek and said, "It's good to see you again, Bella." She nodded, said nothing, but met his eyes fully. That nod held more command than most men's speeches. Then came Lorenzo Bellanti, a rival underboss with too much liquor in his veins and too little sense in his mouth. He swaggered across the floor, drink in hand, the smirk already forming. "Didn't know statues came alive," he said, voice slurring just enough to make it ugly. "Tell me, does the king let you speak now, or do you still sit and look pretty?" Marco didn't wait. The punch came fast and brutal, cracking Lorenzo's jaw before the man could blink. The crowd gasped. Glass shattered against stone. Bellanti stumbled back, blood on his lip, reaching for a gun that wasn't there. Marco didn't care. His fists clenched. His teeth bared. He moved forward again, rage burning through restraint like fire through silk. But then a hand. Light. Calm. Firm. Isabella's hand touched his. Just once. Just enough. He stopped. The contact was brief, but electric. Not pleading. Not fearful. Simply decisive. And somehow, that one quiet gesture was louder than any threat. Marco's chest heaved. His fists uncurled. Bellanti was hauled away by his own men, muttering curses between bloody teeth. The music stuttered, then resumed. The crowd returned to its rhythm, as if violence were merely another tradition at DeLuca events. She didn't look at him. She didn't squeeze his hand. She just let go and turned, walking back toward the edge of the courtyard. Her gown rippled behind her like a banner in retreat. But it wasn't retreat. It was rain. Marco followed her, slower this time. Not because he needed to protect her. Because he needed to catch up. She had taken back her space in this world, not with a speech, not with revenge, but with presence. And the room bent around her accordingly. Later that night, back at the villa, Marco knocked gently on her door. She opened it without surprise. He held nothing in his hands. He didn't have to. "Thank you," he said softly, the words heavier than gold. She didn't speak. But she nodded once, and that single movement carried the weight of something ancient and unspoken. Not forgiveness. Not affection. But recognition. That what had been broken was not irreparable. Then she closed the door. He stood there for a moment after, hand still lifted in air, breath quiet, heart aching in a way that didn't hurt, just reminded him he was still alive. She had claimed her place again. In public. In silence. As his equal, or something far more terrifying to men like him, a woman who no longer needed him to be whole. From that night on, the household changed again. There was no announcement. But her seat returned at dinners. Her presence once again shaped the hours. And no one questioned it. Not even Marco. He knew now she wasn't returning to what had been. She was rebuilding on her terms. She chose when to stay, when to leave, when to touch. And the man who once ruled the city had never felt smaller or more willing to be remade. Have you ever found strength not in speaking up but in simply staying present? Drop a comment if you've ever witnessed power in silence, or subscribe to follow the quiet storm as it continues to rise. The winters had returned, heavier now, older, as if even the seasons remembered the weight of their story. Nearly 10 years had passed since the word that broke her, and time had reshaped everything, even him. The house no longer felt like a palace of command. It was a monastery of restraint. Marco DeLuca, the man once feared across oceans, now moved like a ghost of gentleness through his own halls. And tonight, he sat by her bedside, a folded letter trembling in his hand. The snow fell beyond the window, steady and slow, painting the glass with quiet lace. Isabella lay reclined, awake but still, her profile silvered by moonlight. The candle beside her burned low, its flame bending in rhythm with her breathing. He had been reading for an hour, words written long ago but never sent, never dared. When he finished the last line, the silence between them pressed like snowfall, soft and heavy all at once. "I wrote this the night I almost left," he said finally, voice roughened by time. "It was after the Giordano job, before you came to the hospital." He smiled faintly, but it was an exhausted smile, one born of memory and loss. "I thought about walking away then. Selling everything, disappearing. But I didn't." His gaze lifted, resting on her motionless form. "Because I couldn't imagine you not finding me." He set the letter down beside him, smoothing its edges with the care of a man who knew he'd never earn forgiveness, only moments. "You don't owe me anything, Isabella," he said softly. "Not your words, not your presence. Not even your eyes when I speak." The words cracked in his throat like old wood under strain. "But if I die before you ever speak to me again, I'll still consider you the greatest love I've ever known." He inhaled slowly, as if steadying himself against the echo that did not come. She didn't move. Only the snow did, whispering against the glass, melting in streaks that caught the candlelight. He waited, eyes tracing the slow rise and fall of her chest beneath the sheets. Every part of him wanted to stay, but his heart knew when to retreat. He rose, old bones creaking like confession, and gathered the letter again. "Good night," he murmured, voice nearly swallowed by the fire. He turned toward the door, stepped soundless on the carpet. The latch was cold under his palm. For a moment, he let his forehead rest against it, as if the weight of her silence could pass through and finally undo him completely. Then he began to pull it open. That was when he heard it. It was faint at first, fragile, uncertain, like the sound of a ghost remembering how to breathe. His hand froze mid-motion. He thought at first it was the wind, or the glass shifting in the storm. Then it came again, unmistakable, breaking the air with the smallest, most human sound. "Marco." He turned. She was looking at him. Her lips trembled slightly, eyes steady, but shining with something raw, not weakness, but arrival. Her voice, unused for years, carried the weight of every unspoken word that had ever existed between them. It cracked on the edges, rough as gravel, but it was hers. It was her choosing to speak. He didn't move at first. Couldn't. His heart stuttered in his chest like something waking from the dead. Isabella, he whispered, his name for her falling like prayer, trembling between disbelief and devotion. She blinked once, tears gathering but not falling. You stayed, she said quietly, each syllable shaped with effort, like sculpting air from stone. He crossed the room before his mind caught up. He didn't touch her, not yet, not until she gave the smallest nod, and then he sank to his knees beside the bed, forehead pressing to her hand. The contact was reverent, desperate, holy. For a long moment, there was no movement, just the sound of their breathing in unison and the faint crackle of snow melting against the pane. Her hand trembled as it rested in his hair. The gesture was soft but absolute, the kind that rewrites the meaning of mercy. He closed his eyes. If she had said nothing more for the rest of his life, that moment would have been enough. You stayed, she whispered again, stronger now, and though her voice broke, it did not sound fragile. It sounded alive. Marco lifted his head, eyes wet, the lines of his face softened by something close to peace. There was nowhere else to go, he said. I built a world too loud to hear you. When it fell quiet, I finally did. Her lips parted, almost a smile, almost a sob. The kind of expression that only 10 years of silence could birth. The candle's flame flickered between them, thin but unwavering. Outside, the storm began to ease, the snow thinning to gentle dust over the sleeping city. For the first time in years, the house felt warm, not because of fire or comfort, but because a single word had turned it human again. He leaned forward until their foreheads touched, their breath mingling in the soft air. Neither spoke further. Neither needed to. He stayed there until the candle burned low, until the world outside the window began to pale with dawn. And when he finally rose, he didn't thank her. He didn't dare reduce what she had given him to something that small. He only took her hand again, gently, fully, completely, and pressed it once to his chest, over the heart that had waited a decade for the sound of glass breaking. The silence that followed was no longer hollow. It was whole. The sound of her voice still echoed in his chest as he turned back toward her. She was standing now, not halfway, not leaning, but fully upright, her bare feet steady on the floor, her back lit by the dim glow of a candle long melted to its end. Her gown shifted like shadow around her legs, and in that moment, she looked neither fragile nor distant, she looked present. Marco had imagined this 1,000 times in 10 years, always with more drama, more apology, more words. But this quiet, this real, was more sacred than anything he had dared to dream. Her lips parted again, and though her voice cracked at the edges, it held. Marco. Just his name. Nothing more. As if to say, you're here. And I see you now. And somehow, that was enough. He took one slow step toward her, cautious not to rush a thing so newly reborn. She didn't retreat. Her hands, once folded defensively in her lap for years, now rested at her sides, not reaching, but not closed either. He stopped just short of touching her. I didn't know, he said softly, the words stitched with grief, but shaped by truth. I know, she whispered. Her voice was low, rough with disuse, but the clarity in her eyes made it strong. You didn't look. The statement wasn't an accusation. It was a fact, spoken without malice. A map of how they got here, drawn in the language of wounds and waiting. He nodded, the shame no longer crushing, only acknowledged, like a scar finally named. I'm still learning how to see you. That truth cost him nothing now, because it had already cost him everything. Her gaze didn't soften, but it didn't turn away. That, too, was new. Trust, not restored, but rising. She stepped forward, one step, and another. Her presence filled the space between them like dawn bleeding across cold stone. No music swelled. No tears fell. But something broke in him quietly, not in pain, but in awe. He reached for her slowly, palms open, the way a man approaches a living flame. She let him. His hands found her face, cupping her jaw as though it might still vanish. Her skin was warm beneath his calloused fingertips, and when she didn't flinch, didn't pull away, his breath shuddered with relief. She was here. And she had let him stay. Her eyes closed for just a moment as she leaned into the touch. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't forgiving everything at once. But it was choice, hers. Marco bent his forehead to hers, the space between them folding into stillness. Their breath, for the first time in a decade, moved in rhythm again. "You stayed," she whispered. He nodded, voice too thick for words. His hands trembled where they touched her. Not from fear. From reverence. He had waited 10 years for permission to feel this again. Not power, not dominance, but closeness. She pulled back gently, just enough to look into his eyes. There was something there now that had been missing for so long, not love, not yet. Something more enduring. Recognition. She saw him now, the man stripped of cruelty, stripped of excuses. And she did not turn away. They spoke little after that. A few words exchanged like offerings. "I missed you. You changed. I had to. So did I. No more apologies. No more explanations. There would be time, or there wouldn't." But for now, they were together in the same room, not as ghosts, not as ruins, but as survivors. He offered his hand. She looked at it for a long moment, then took it, her fingers sliding into his with quiet finality. They were older now. Changed. Not returning to what they were, but standing on new ground entirely. The Empire might still call him king, but tonight, he walked beside its only queen. They left her room together, stepped slow but sure, as if learning to walk again. The hallway was long, silent, dressed in moonlight and memory. Their hands remained joined, not tightly, but completely. And every creak of the old floor beneath them sounded like ceremony. He didn't lead. She didn't follow. They moved as one. The villa, once a mausoleum of pride and silence, breathed differently as they passed. No guards shadowed them. No servants lingered. The house understood, as if even its walls had waited for this night. As if the years of quiet had been holding their breath for this return. At the end of the corridor, where the main hall opened beneath stained glass, they paused. A winter breeze slid through the high windows, carrying the scent of snow and wood smoke. Marco looked at her, unsure of where to go next, only knowing he didn't want to let go. But Isabella turned her head and looked down the corridor ahead, a small nod breaking across her features, faint, steady, decided. Forward, it said. He followed her gaze. And then, for the first time in 10 years, they walked the heart of the house together. Side by side. No title between them. No hierarchy. Just two people who had waited, who had broken, who had stayed. No one saw them. No one needed to. Because in the quiet heart of that house, something larger than reputation, legacy, or vengeance had finally taken root. She had spoken. He had listened. And in that sacred, hard-earned silence, they had chosen each other again. And in the empire where silence reigned, a single word rebuilt what power never could. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.